1-888-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion on this Friday afternoon. Delighted that you are with us. This program is for you if you are a non-Catholic. That's right, a program on a Catholic network for non-Catholics. Well, how does that work? What's the point? Well, the point is, if you are a Methodist and you're listening to this program, you probably have some questions about what the Catholic faith actually teaches and what it does not teach. And maybe you don't know any Catholics personally, and so you don't know where to go to get those answers. You can go right here, and that's why we're here. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response, and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And of course, you can always send us an email. We'll get to one of those in a minute. The address for that, ctc@ewtn.com. Pedro Aquiles, our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Rich Jesse handling social media. If you would like to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we're streaming on both those platforms right now. Just put your question in the comments box if you would. And then Rich will see that. He'll shoot it to us here in the studio. And on Friday, the phones tend to get rather busy. So my recommendation is call now if you've got that question. Don't wait till we're into the show, 45 minutes. We just won't be able to get to you. 833-288-EWTN. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, thank you.
We were, just before we went to do this live show, we actually recorded a Mailbag program that's going to air next Wednesday. And at the end of that program, I asked a question that we just flat ran out of time and could not answer.
Well, moreover, you stumped me. And like the question, does Dr. Anders ever get stumped? I got stumped because you asked a question. I hadn't actually thought about it in a while, and I didn't have an answer ready at hand. And I had to take 5 minutes between shows to sit back and reflect and get an answer. But now I'm ready. I've got an answer.
He is ready, and here we go. The question is from John, who says, in the Bible, when John mentions mortal sin, he says something like, I don't suggest to pray about that. Now, what does he mean by this statement?
Thank you. That I can handle. Now I got it. Okay.
All right.
So John's first epistle addresses people or the fact that people have left the congregation. All right. So in 1 John chapter 2, he specifically mentions people that formerly belonged to the congregation and then walked away from it. Okay. Now, throughout ancient Christianity, biblical Christianity and second century Christianity, there was a real deep skepticism about the spiritual state of people who apostatized. And so much so that, there were people who took the position that those folks are beyond redemption. Now, that eventually the church ruled that was incorrect, but there was a hardline party within the church into the second century that thought, and based on some biblical texts like the biblical book of Hebrews chapter 6 and chapter 10 and others, that when people apostatized, they were done. It was like one and done. You get one mortal sin and one absolution. After that, you're toast, right? And that turned out not to be the official teaching of the church, but there was a party that held that view. And in practical terms, St. Paul does say that we should prioritize people within the church for our charitable activity and the administration of the sacraments. So in Galatians chapter 6, for example, he says, as we have the opportunity to do good, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them that are of the household of faith. Especially unto them that are of the household of faith. And in 1 Corinthians 5, St. Paul says, you should judge the evildoer among you, but not the person who's outside the church. Kind of leave them to their own devices. And, people often think the Catholics are judgmental because we won't let non-Catholics go to communion. And the real point of the fact is that it's only the Catholics that are being judged. That's why they get to go. The non-Catholics, because we refrain from judging them one way or another, we just leave them to their own devices until they're ready to become Catholic, right? It's not a refusal to judge. So all that is to say there's a context here where when somebody walks away from the church, they have decided to deprive themselves of the church's ministrations, especially in including the administration of the sacrament, especially in including the sacrament of confession and absolution. And I think that's the better context. The way to understand this text is, St. Paul is not saying that you can't pray for your non-Catholic relatives, but people who have apostatized and walked away from the church have sort of put themselves outside of the church's ministry. The Mass is not offered for everybody. It's not. It's offered for the church, right? The prayers of the church in the Mass are oriented to the good of the body of Christ, which is the living Catholic Church. Uh-huh. If you put yourself outside that, well, you're not the recipient of that, right? I mean, you got to come back in to get that.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're completely outside of redemption forever, but you are depriving yourself of the grace of belonging to the Catholic community. Christ actually says that when people are unrepentant, you kick them out, and he says, quote, treat them like a tax collector or a sinner, and not the kind that he went and had dinner with. Right, but the kind who are obstinate and want no part of the truth.
Okay, very good. And I'm glad we could answer that for you, John. Thanks so much for your email. Here's one from Alan. Did the baby Jesus know that he was God, since God is omniscient?
Okay, yes, but. Baby Jesus knew he was God. Baby Jesus had omniscience. But his human intellect was still a human intellect. And so, let's say... most children have a limited vocabulary relative to adult vocabulary. They just haven't had time to hear and assimilate, say the 30 or 40 or 50,000 words that goes into the passive vocabulary of most grown-ups, that are educated, right? They start out with a few words, they add a few more, right? Jesus would have developed as a human being in that same fashion, right?
Okay.
And so how does it work when you have a finite human intellect hypostatically conjoined to an infinite divine intellect? I have no frigging idea. Right?
Okay.
But we do know that Christ was fully human, and that would have meant that he would have passed through all the developmental stages that that Jean Piaget would have recognized in child psychology. He would have had all of that and a divine nature. How that hangs together beats me.
Got it. Alan, thanks so much for your email. We'll get to Dawn and Miles in a moment. Lines open for you as well. 833-288-EWTN for Call to Communion.
This is a digital moment with Sandra McDevitt. Did you know there is a legend about the snowdrop, that tiny white flower which peeks up from under the snow sometime in March? Eve wept over the desolation she had brought when paradise was closed. The world was covered with a blanket of continually falling snow. God sent an angel to comfort Eve. As he spoke to her, he caught a snowflake upon which he breathed, bidding it to blossom, saying, "This is a sign, Eve, to thee, that sun and summer soon shall be." The snowflake fluttered to the ground where the angel stood, and the snowflake had fallen. A circle of fragile white flowers grew up. The beautiful snowdrop was given to the earth. This is a reminder that God sends us comfort in our time of need. I'm Sandra McDevitt for EWTN Radio.
EWTN Radio is growing. Are you an experienced radio producer looking for an opportunity to help forward Mother Angelica's mission of evangelization? We need a passionate, multi-skilled, talented professional who can manage all aspects of producing world-class radio programming. You could be the newest member of the EWTN radio family. If this is you or someone you know, email a resume and cover letter, including salary requirements, to EWTN.com/employment.
It's called a communion on this Friday afternoon with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. 3 lines open right now. You can snag one at 833-288-EWTN if you have a question for David. 833-288-3986. You know, we are on so many different social platforms, it's hard to even list them all, but I can tell you where one of them is, and that is the great Catholic content on the Laudate app. You can also listen to EWTN Radio's live stream by going to Laudate. I believe it's only available on your phone, probably not on a desktop, but the Laudate app is a very good one to have, along with, of course, the EWTN app. Anyway, once you're there on Laudate, click on EWTN, and you are good to go. All right, if you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN, beginning with Dawn. Dawn is in Pompano Beach, Florida, listening on the EWTN app. Hello, Dawn. What's on your mind today?
Hello, Dr. David Anders.
Hi.
I want to know, what is the difference between the Latin Rite Catholics versus the Eastern Rite Catholics?
Sure. Thank you. Appreciate the question. So, first of all, they are subject to different laws. The canon law for the Catholic Church, for the Latin Church, is different from canon law for the Eastern churches. And so, you know, they have different fasts and different liturgical celebrations as well. You know, they have different liturgies. We have the liturgy of the Latin Church, the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. They have the Divine Liturgy, often the Divine Liturgy according to St. John Chrysostom, but there are other Eastern Rite liturgies that are also used according to St. James and others, depending on the rite in question. Their hierarchy functions differently than within the Latin Church, and they have more self-determination and autonomy within the administration of their affairs than Latin Rite bishops do.
Okay.
You know, the Pope still retains his position as the head of the Church with universal jurisdiction, but he exercises that jurisdiction differently with respect to Eastern churches. They have different theological traditions that they draw upon, and so they're going to articulate the deposit of the faith with a slightly different ethos to it. That at times may even be in tension with Latin theologians, and in fact, sometimes is, right? Sometimes is in tension. And that's a beautiful thing, not a bad thing, in that it shows that, you know, the Catholic Church does draw some principled distinctions, some lines in the sand, and say, on this, everybody has to agree, but over here, you don't have to agree, and you can have whole different opinions. And so you'll find differences of opinion, right, in East and West. You know, there's just kind of a different feel to it at the end of the day, because there's a different cultural patrimony standing behind it.
Is that helpful for you, Dawn?
Yes, it is very much. Thank you very much, Dr. David Anders.
Thank you.
May God bless all of you over there at EWTN.
Thank you, Dawn. Appreciate that. And that opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. 2 lines open, as a matter of fact, 833-288-3986. Let's go to Miles now in Boise, Idaho, listening on the great Assault and Light Radio. They're fantastic. Hello, Miles. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. Anders. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, perfect. I've got a headphone in, so sometimes it doesn't work. So my question is, Dr. Anders, you had recommended a book to a caller at one time called The Ways of Mental Prayer. I believe it was you. And so I got the book, and I've been reading it, and how the author talks about, like, approaching God as you begin to pray and you go into his presence. Coming from a Protestant background, I'm convert, I can't help but to think that the book is telling me to go before God kind of like a downcast-eyed dog with its tail between its legs, rather than what Hebrews 4:16 would say, would to go boldly before the throne of God. So I'm conflicted because I can't.
I can help you. I can help you.
Thank you.
I can help you. First of all, it was not I who recommended that book.
Oh, okay.
I did not recommend that book. And this goes to a not very profound but important truth.
Yes.
Radio hosts on EWTN disagree.
Shocking.
Right? And that's okay. That's okay. And in fact, I'm not going to name names.
Yes.
But I've had the experience of listening to EWTN radio and listening to a host and going, my gosh, I don't agree with that.
Now, can you briefly tell us why it's okay for various people on EWTN?
Absolutely, I can do that. And thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you.
So we are all required as Catholics to believe the same thing with regards to the dogmas of the Church and the moral teaching of the Catholic Church. We have to agree on that, okay? We don't have to agree at all on matters of personal spirituality because we're different people. And spirituality is all about how we practically live the demands of Christian life to grow closer to God. But Tom, you and I have different hang-ups.
Yeah.
We have different personalities. We have different imaginations. We have a different cultural background, right? Even though we do share a love of some of the same doggerel pop music, right? And as such, like, different things are going to speak to our moral imagination. And for that reason, it's entirely appropriate that we have different spiritualities, which we do. Like you, Tom, tell me all the time how much your Catholic men's group, the
Cursillo.
Cursillo is meant to you. And I'm so happy for that. And I've never been to Cursillo. And that's okay. It's okay that you go and I don't. That's great. That's fantastic, And I talk about books that I've read that really speak to me, and you're sitting looking at me like, I know when to shut up on the air because Tom's eyes start to glaze over. And I'm like, okay, change direction now, Anders. That's fine. That's fine. One time, somebody called and asked a specific theological question, and he said, "Well, such and such a host said this," and I said, "Well, God bless such and such, but I think it's another position, right?" Such and such called me after the show, and we had a big long discussion about who was right. We agreed to disagree. That's fine, all right? Anyway, I'm getting away from your question. I did not recommend that book.
Okay,
I did not
all
recommend
right.
that book. One thing that you'll find if you study the history of Christian spirituality is that it's not Catholics only. Protestants too. Like that, there is a different disposition in early modernity, right? And you find it in Protestant pietism. You find it in some Catholic devotional writing that really does emphasize this kind of abasement of the human personality that you're talking about, right? I don't find it in the Fathers. I don't find that in Augustine at all. I don't find it in St. Thomas Aquinas at all. So it's a development, right? And I think it's characteristic of like Baroque culture, okay? And then early modern culture in general. And it may be a reflection of the development of absolutism in monarchies. I mean, I don't know what all the cultural factors are. The Annales school of French historical scholarship focuses on like the broad scale study of mentalities. Somebody like Lucien Febvre, for example, who looks at this kind of thing. And you can track this in the development of spirituality. So think about how Jonathan Edwards, for example, in the 18th century, would say in his Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God that God regards you, namely the Christians in Northampton, Massachusetts, as more despicable than we would regard the most loathsome serpent.
Wow.
Right. And so, Puritanism is just replete with this kind of stuff. So it's not unique to early modern Catholicism.
Okay.
At all. All right. So what do you do about that? Well, I don't do that. Like I find that, like you, I find that an entirely unhelpful way to think. I don't find it reflective of Jesus' teaching or the New Testament. I don't find it reflective of the Church Fathers. I don't find it reflective of what I think of as the best in Catholic mysticism. Like Teresa of Avila, who's sort of like she's not a very good writer, but she's a fantastic mystic. Her stuff is much more focused on how can I discern sort of the hang-ups and impediments in my own personality that are preventing my union with God and get rid of those, okay? Someone who is a much more approachable and I think sort of kind and gentle Catholic writer on spirituality that I would recommend to you, not the book The Ways of Mental Prayer, would be Jacques Philippe, Father Jacques Philippe. Right. He has a book called Time for God, which is about mental prayer and contemplation and the development of the interior life. And he basically says at the end of the day, and I would do read that one. But he says at the end of the day that your job in prayer is nothing other than cultivating the kind of disposition that can approach God with faith and charity, right? And the way you get there is in a certain respect up to you, right? So Timothy Gallagher, Father Timothy Gallagher,
yes,
who has made such a name for himself as an expositor of St. Ignatius's rules of spiritual discernment. His stuff is really helpful in this regard, right? And in fact, if you look at Ignatius of Loyola, for that matter, take a look at his spiritual exercises, you're not going to find Ignatius advocating sort of craven self-loathing as the proper disposition. Instead, his whole frame of reference is that he takes it for granted that God gives me delight in my spiritual life. And one of his principal rules is, go with that. Go with that. Like, when I give myself to prayer and seeking God, if something's working for me and it's causing me to have a sort of delight in God and the life of holiness and the saints, go with that. Go with that. That's one of his rules of spiritual discernment. So, maybe there's someone in the world for whom like this self-abasing thing is a positive. I mean, I guess there were early modern people that came to holiness doing that. And I would cautiously say, well, okay, if you have to, right?
Yeah.
But for many of us, especially modern people, I just find that very counterproductive. At the end of the day, the whole Catholic faith, all the accoutrements of Catholicism are means to an end. And the end is the legitimate love, the genuine love of God and neighbor through the development of the virtues. And whatever serves that end is the right spirituality for you.
Beautiful. Miles, thanks so much for checking in from Boise, and we're glad that you're listening on the great Salt and Light Radio. Still time for your phone call here at EWTN's Call to Communion, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Richard is listening in Kansas on the great Divine Mercy Radio. Hello, Richard. What's on your mind today?
Well, I'd like to ask Dr. Anders if the Church recognizes the baptism of the worldwide Church of God.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I know in its founding that Armstrong initially held a non-Trinitarian view.
Herbert W. Armstrong, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I think there may be people in the movement who have moved in a more Trinitarian direction, but I have a queasy feeling in my stomach about it. Right? I don't know for sure, but my gut says, well, they would not have recognized the validity of a non-Trinitarian baptism. Are there Trinitarian baptisms that mean by the Trinity what the Catholic Church means by the Trinity? Mm-hmm. I mean, that would be a question for discernment of the Holy See. I don't know what the modern state of the question is, but I can tell you that in its founding, that would have been problematic because they were non-Trinitarian Christians.
Richard, thanks so much for your call. Here's an email from Gina. How do I respond to my friend who is a determinist and moral relativist, but still believes that we should impose our morality on others?
Well, that is a weird position to hold.
I thought so.
That is a weird position to hold. So how should you respond to them? Al-Ghazali, the Muslim Islamic philosopher, once said that people who deny the law of non-contradiction should be exposed to torments until they admit that to be tortured and not to be tortured is not the same thing. Right?
Yeah.
I do not recommend that, But tongue in cheek, I sort of wonder if you're determinist who thinks that we have no control over our actions, that we're all just automatons, and who's also a moral relativist. I wonder what this individual would say if you walked up and slapped them in the face, and demanded their wallet or something. If they would regard that as an inappropriate activity that you could have refrained from doing, right?
Maybe.
I mean, in other words, like the contradiction of determinism is less a philosophical argument than a kind of participated demonstration, in the way that Johnson was when he was asked about Berkeley's idealism, the doctrine that matter doesn't exist and it's all just ideas, walked over and kicked a rock and said, "Thus I refute Berkeley,"
Love it.
And so that's kind of that's kind of my position here, right? There's a sense in which I'm a determinist. There's a sense in which Catholics are determinists in the sense that, first of all, we believe that all of reality falls within the scope of God's providence, right? Which we can't frustrate. You know, the one prayer in the tradition that seems most superfluous is "Thy will be done." I'm not saying you shouldn't pray it. You should pray it, right?
Yeah,
but because that's going to happen, folks.
It just is.
God's will is going to get done. The real question is, the point of the prayer is not to demand that God effectuate what he wants, but it's to accustom me to bringing my own will in alignment with his. Since his will is going to be inevitably done, I'd better get on with the program, right? That's the idea. In terms of the moral relativism, you can acknowledge that there are many relativistic aspects to morality without thinking that morality as such is relative. Now, if morality means what the Catholic Church means by it, which are the conditions that tend to human flourishing, I think it's pretty evident that those at some level are objective, right? I mean, like try treating cancer with, like mushed jellyfish and see how that goes for you. You know, it's like it's just not as effective as some other treatment, right? There are objective truths about the human person that can be rationally discovered. And the same thing holds in the moral life.
Gina, thanks so much for your email. Calls are coming in, but we've got
mushed jellyfish works. I don't know.
We've got room for your call here at 833-288-EWTN for Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Do stay with us.
This is Montse Alvarado. Join me for topics that matter to you on EWTN News in Depth tonight, 8 Eastern on EWTN Radio and Television.
Join Archbishop Jose Gomez in sharing the good news.
The solemnity of the Annunciation of our Lord is the beginning of the mystery of redemption, the first of the joyful mysteries of our salvation. It is always nice to celebrate this feast during the season of Lent, because the truth of the Annunciation is the message that God is with us. God goes with us on our journey of life. Because Jesus has entered our world, we no longer live in darkness. The path we walk now is filled with light, the light of Christ. So let us ask our Blessed Mother Mary to help us always walk in the light of Christ, and may she help us always share the joy of Jesus with everyone.
Visit lacatholics.org to find ways to connect with our faith community in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles.
We need to pray for priests that they have courage and strength to be faithful. Pray for bishops who have whole dioceses under them, and they're responsible for everyone. Religious who teach, we should pray for them. Cardinals, our Holy Father, our families, our neighbors, everybody who has a hard time living the truth or preaching the truth. We all need that extra strength of prayer.
Celebrating the precious gift of life.
This is EWTN Radio.
I'm Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers. Join me for Beacon of Truth today at 4 p.m. Eastern.
On the next Beacon of Truth, what is holiness? And looking into Soulful Psalm 78.
Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, still time for your phone calls here at EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. That phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Love to chat with you on this beautiful Friday afternoon. Hey, if you're listening to us in Cleveland, your EWTN radio station needs to hear from you next week. That would be the great AM 1260 The Rock. They're going to be airing their Spring Spirit Drive starting on Tuesday. So if you're listening in Cleveland or really anywhere, please remember to support your Catholic radio station. Here's a great question from an anonymous listener who says, "Hey, Dr. Anders and Mr. Price, I am joining the church soon. I'm working on my first confession, but I cannot imagine confessing all of my sins and then seeing the priest every time I go to Mass. I had an abortion, and I just do not see how I can go to him and confess this and all of my sexual immorality, not to mention everything else, and then see him at Mass the next day. I realize that part of confession is humility, but is it supposed to be a constant humiliation for the rest of my life? or at least as long as he is the priest at my church. Could I go to one parish for confession and then Mass at my own? Please help. Thank you, Anonymous.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So I got a couple things to say about this. First of all, you do not have to go to your pastor for confession. You do not have to go to your pastor for confession. You can go to any Catholic priest who has faculties here confession. Yeah. Anyone will do. Anyone will do. Okay, and you know, I myself am sometimes selective in who I go to confession to. And you know what? One of the downsides to being a radio personality is that you typically have a recognizable voice. And so even behind the screen, you know, sometimes people will forget who you are. And it's always, for me, kind of a joy, right, to have the opportunity for a truly anonymous confession where I think there's very little chance this individual knows who I am, right? So it's okay. I'm sympathetic to the concern, right? That being said, I think you're overreacting here, and here's why. You will not believe the stuff that Catholic priests have heard in the confessional. You cannot believe it. I mean, I once talked to a priest who had been ordained 2 days. 2 days. I said, "So, Father, you've been ordained 2 days." "Yep." I said, "Have you been in the confessional yet?" He said, "Hoy boy, howdy, yes." And he says, I couldn't believe right off with stuff I was hearing right off the bat. You name it, like whatever the worst thing you could imagine is, he was hearing it from the very beginning, right? Ten Commandments, right? Exactly. And so whatever you think you've done, I guarantee you they get inundated with this on a daily basis. They get inundated with it. Although, you know, there are people who don't. I mean, Fulton Sheen once said that hearing the confessions of nuns was like being stoned to death with popcorn. You know, but or cotton balls or something. Yeah. But that's an exaggeration too, because they can do some bad stuff as well. Anyway, yeah, it's just you think he's going to remember and judge. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But yeah, you don't have to go to the pastor. You can go to anybody you want to. All right. And no, it's not supposed to be. The whole point of the anonymity is it's not supposed to be a humiliation. Sure. All right. And thanks so much for your anonymous email. Glad that we could answer that on today's EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Still time for your call at 833-288-EWTN. About this time, I like to say last call for your call, 833-288-3986. Here's an emailed question from Jason. Dr. Anders, my understanding of Catholic morality is that it is a sin to act in doubt. So does this mean someone has to have moral certainty that an act is not sinful before performing or refraining from an act? Or is the view that one has to have a probabilistic or even reasonable certainty about the morality of a particular act? I struggle with scrupulosity. I often find myself in states of uncertainty about whether something qualifies as sinful, and I'm wondering how to apply this teaching to what experience with my anxiety. Thank you, Jason. Yeah, I really appreciate it. So scrupulosity is a special case. Scrupulosity is a special case because the problem with the scrupulous is they find a way to construe everything as sinful. Yeah. I mean, I have known people who are scrupulous to the point of almost psychosis, where it's unbelievable the things that they can conceive of as being sinful. I mean, things that are so anodyne and neutral and just non-issues. And so if you listen, but here's the thing, that's not conscience. The voice of scrupulosity is, conscience is a judgment of the practical reason. That's what conscience is. Okay? And it's from first principles, and it takes into account circumstance and the genuine good of the human person, right? And if you're functioning from a different paradigm, right, it's not conscience. It stops being conscience. So what do you do about that? Well, believe it or not, there are times when the advice you give to a scrupulous person has got to be, do what feels wrong. And that's so counterintuitive, but it actually is for their moral good.
Yeah.
Because scrupulosity actually destroys your ability to discern the good of the human person, which ought to be the basis for your rational moral decision making.
Sure.
And with any kind of obsessive compulsive disorder, the way you get over it is exposure therapy. Right? I remember one time reading a narrative about somebody who had an obsessive fear of dogs. Couldn't even be in the room of a dog without passing out. And so what the therapist would do is first he puts him in a room next to the dog. Not in the same room with the dog, just next door to the dog. Until he's comfortable with that. And then you open the door between the two rooms so he can see the dog and he gets comfortable with that. And then, let him handle a pillow that the dog has sat on until he gets comfortable with that. Eventually he works his way up to letting Rover lick his hand. And when he's recovered from his fainting spell, we try that again. and you work your way up gradually, doing what feels wrong, doing what feels uncomfortable until you can acclimate yourself to doing that sort of thing. And that's why one of the pieces of advice the church gives the scrupulous is you have to put yourself under the obedience of a confessor who knows your situation.
Right.
And so let's say, for example, that the scrupulous person feels like all of their communions are sacrilegious. Right. And so every time they go to communion, they're mortally sinning. And the confessor knows that's not the case. And so the confessor might say, I order you under obedience to go to communion. And knowing that is going to absolutely torture the soul.
Yeah.
Right? This person is going to be so worked up about that, right? But they do it. If obedient to the confessor, they surrender their judgment in the matter because they don't have the use of their own intellect here.
Yeah.
They go, right? And they go again, and they go again, and go again, and go again, and go again, until they become habituated to the discomfort, and finally it stops being uncomfortable, right? And then they can have a normal sacramental life. But you've got to have that third party. You've got to have that priest or that advisor who can tell you, look, I am rational in this matter. You're not. You need to do what I say because you're suffering here, and my job is to help you. You can't listen to the voice of scrupulosity. It's not the same thing as conscience.
And certainly the answer would not be to run to another confessor in a case like that, because then you're starting over.
No, you don't want to do it. Now, don't find some hardliner, honestly, when you find this person. Find a compassionate priest who really wants to help you, and don't find a priest who's scrupulous, in other words.
Got it. Okay, thanks so much for your question, and it's called to communion here on EWTN. We have a question here now from Miguel in Louisiana. This is what he wrote. A politician said the following, apparently in reference to arguing against assisting other countries in their strife, war, and struggles, including war and emigration. Here's the quote. There is a Christian concept that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens, and then after that prioritize the rest of the world. That's the end of the quote. So Miguel says, is St. Augustine's order of love, ordo amoris, the concept he's referring to? Is this hierarchy of love concept what Jesus had in mind about loving thy neighbor? Love your show. Deeply thankful for the amazing mind and clarity and charity of Dr. Anders. Top-notch content on Call to Communion every day. Thanks, Miguel in Louisiana.
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So one thing I am not going to do and don't want to be drawn into is a debate about public policy, about political policy.
Right.
I am not. So nothing I say should be construed as taking a position in any kind of contemporary American political debate. And politicians, of course, are very adept at quoting theology or religion or biblical verses to sustain or support their particular policy position.
Really?
Yep. And that doesn't make them rational actors or honest, shooters and that sort of thing, right? So I'm just not taking a policy position. St. Paul definitely seems to believe that there is an ordo amoris, and that, for example, it would be illegitimate for a person to seek office in the church if they lack the ability to take care of their family, right? And one of the few New Testament passages that my father ever quoted to me was the admonition, the man who doesn't care for his family is worse than an infidel. Right?
Wow. Yeah.
And Paul, of course, tells us that one is to love one's wife or one's spouse as one's own body, and seek that person's good. And he recognizes as a fact that a married man, for example, will necessarily care for the needs of his wife in preference to, say, the needs of the rest of the body of Christ. And that's appropriate. It's one of the reasons that Paul says if you can avoid marriage, avoid it, because it does entangle you in that, but it's inevitable that it will, and it's not immoral.
Okay.
Right? Now, another principle of Catholic moral theology is that ultimately what the rule of human conduct is the rule of right reason. And that's a doctrine of Catholic moral thought. It's central to St. Thomas's whole analysis, right? That right reason is the rule of human conduct. And you don't have to have a biblical passage in defense of every moral judgment. What you need is a rational conception of the human good. Okay? Now, if that's your criterion, it is patently obvious, at least to me, that the people who have the primary moral responsibility, say, for taking care of a child, are the people who brought the child into the world, if they're capable.
Sure.
Right? And it is in the child's immense best interest for the parents to have that kind of solicitude. Now, you cannot, for example, and I'm not saying that the sexuals have to play out this way, but you cannot be a stay-at-home mom and not preference your own children over the neighbor's kids. Try it sometime. It doesn't work. It's just a physical impossibility.
Yeah.
Let's say you're a homeschool mom. You cannot homeschool every kid in the neighborhood. You can't. Maybe you can support other moms or other dads who are doing it, but there's a finite number you can deal with.
Sure.
Okay. And Providence plopped this kid on your lap, not the other guy. It's obvious. The principle of subsidiarity is that you have to deal with local problems locally if you can, right? But there's another moral principle, which is solidarity, which is that, yes, you do local problems locally, and there is kind of ordo amoris within the family and in the civilization, but it shouldn't be to the exclusion of solidarity with the whole human race. And Christ makes that very clear when he says that, there are people who are going to have to say no to father and mother and children and wives and lands and fields and everything out of preference for the gospel. So that prioritizing of the human family is not an absolute good. And there might be times when you have to say no to some good of your family in order to meet the demands of the love of neighbor. Right.
Yeah.
But that takes prudent discernment. And that's called policy, and we're not getting into that.
No. Miguel in Louisiana, thanks so much for your email. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let me tell you about one of our wonderful weekend programming, and that is The Spirit World. We air that on Saturday mornings, tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. Eastern, here on EWTN. On tomorrow's show, Prophecy. Raises so many questions, doesn't it? How can you tell if a prophecy is real or false? And what role does prophecy have in the modern life of the church? Listen to The Spirit World. Call in tomorrow morning with your questions. It's a live program tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. The Spirit World with Debbie Georgiani and Adam Bly. A fantastic program for you to check out tomorrow morning here on EWTN. Here's a question now from Thomas, who says, on a recent show, Dr. Andrews responded to a question regarding general absolution given in Mass by saying that you can never be assured of absolution and thus cannot go to communion until giving confession to a priest and being absolved by him. So, how does that align with Scripture, which tells us that if we confess our sins, He, God, is faithful and just to forgive them and also to cleanse us from all unrighteousness? He's quoting John 1:9. If we are cleansed of unrighteousness, we are righteous and would seem able to receive communion. Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So I think you may have slightly misrepresented my position. And obviously, I don't have the radio show in front of me right now, so I don't know the context that I was responding to. So let me back up, and we'll start fresh.
Okay.
You can confess your sins directly to God without the mediation of a priest and receive God's forgiveness. And the Church says that to do that, you need perfect contrition. And so the psalmist says, sacrifice and offering you do not delight in, O Lord, but a contrite heart you will not despise. Therefore, wash me and cleanse me, and I'll be clean. Right? Well, that's true. That works. Catholics teach that. Okay? the question isn't, can I be certain that God will forgive the contrite sinner? Yes, I can be certain that God will do that. The question is, can I be certain that I am perfectly contrite? And that's a taller order.
Yeah.
You know, can I subjectively evaluate the quality of my contrition such that I can say with absolute certainty, yes, I am contrite in the proper sense, right? And the reason that we have sacraments at all, not just confession, but any sacrament, is so that we can have an objective point of reference for the administration of grace and not be dependent on purely subjective criterion. All right, now, within the history of Protestantism, which, of course, got rid of the sacrament of confession, this question of how do I judge the quality of my interior life became a dominant preoccupation and produced endless quantities of literature and disagreement among Puritan and Protestant thinkers. So something like Jonathan Edwards' book, Religious Affections, for example, is a really magisterial treatment of this question from a Puritan point of view. It's a great book in many respects, right? But it's motivated by false problem, I think. And, Edwards gives this, a book-length treatment of the question, how do I discern the proper spiritual motions in my soul to know that I'm in a spiritual state, right? And the fact that he requires a book to do it, and it's an intense work of psychology, shows you, like, the depths to which Protestant analysis of this problem goes. Cardinal Newman, identified this tendency within Calvinism as what he called self-contemplation. And it is a kind of navel-gazing preoccupation of a lot of Protestantism, and he contrasts that with the much more sort of objective position that a Catholic can take. Because Christ instituted the sacrament, I don't have to be objectively certain of my own subjective position. I can be objectively certain about the offer of grace in the sacrament, right? The sacraments are not there to be a kind of barrier between me and God. They're there to facilitate it and to ease my conscience, to make it more easier to practice the faith, not harder, right? Now, as a matter of canon law, the Church teaches that we are not to go to communion if we're conscious of grave sin, unless we've been to sacramental confession. So even if, say, the Confiteor at the beginning of Mass, if said with true contrition, is sufficient to absolve my sin, it's not sufficient to meet the canonical obligation for confession.
Okay. And we thank you so much for that question. Call to communion here on EWTN. Here's a rather long question from Stacy. I am Catholic. You may want to take notes on this one, David. I am Catholic. I married my husband, who is Methodist, in the Catholic Church. I was attending church with my husband at his church early in our marriage. I don't know where my head was back then, but when we had children, they were baptized in my husband's church, the Methodist Church. I've been attending my church for several years now. He does not attend with me very often. Both of my children, being young adults now, have sincerely wanted to join the Catholic faith. I just feel like I've failed them, and I'm feeling broken because of the decision I made so many years ago. Hindsight is 20/20. I would like to help my daughter with what her options are. If her husband does not wish to get an annulment from a previous marriage that took place by the justice of the peace, he was never baptized, and she wishes to join the Catholic faith, what options are there for her? She's already been enrolled in the classes for several months, just now has found out this is preventing her from moving forward. Her son has already been baptized in the Catholic faith. Would truly appreciate your help. Sincerely, Stacy.
Okay, thanks.
Did you get all that?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so a couple things. First of all, I'm so sorry that you are beating yourself up about this, because it sounds to me like you're a great mom and you've done a great job, and the fact that your kids want to be Catholic is like no harm, no foul.
Yeah.
I mean, like, that at the end of the day, they're going to be Catholic, and that's all good, right? So, like, please don't beat yourself up. I mean, you don't know how often the calls are about traffic in the other direction. So, God bless you, okay? Now, your daughter is presumably in an invalid marriage. I think you said she's married to a guy who was previously married.
Yeah.
And therefore, the marriage is presumptively invalid, but he doesn't want to go through the process of getting an annulment. What can she do? Okay, so a couple things. One, if he gets the annulment, and doesn't want to have his marriage convalidated in the Catholic Church, there is a procedure for that called ratification, where you can have your marriage declared valid without going through the whole process of a marriage ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
That's something to keep in the back of your mind. The annulment's a different issue. I'm not an expert in canon law or the judicial procedure of annulments. I mean, I presume you have talked to the canonists in question and explored what your options are. Which I would recommend doing.
Yes.
Okay, I'd really, talk to the priest, but also to see if you can't get a hold of the tribunal and talk to the judicial vicar or somebody and figure out what your options are. But I also think that from your daughter's perspective, she ought to just communicate to her husband, like, this is really important to me. This is really important to me, and I'm sorry. At the end of the day, I mean, this is a hard option. But if he just absolutely will not go along, there are two other options. One is, and I don't want her to do this as a kind of threat. We're not trying to manipulate him, but for the sake of her conscience, she can refrain from marital relations, like not as a manipulative tool to control his behavior, right? But as a, like, I'm not going to leave you because we maybe have kids together or something, and the church says that in situations like this where two people are not validly married, but they have practical reasons why they can't separate, you can live under the same roof and just cease conjugal relations.
Okay.
And you make that commitment in the context of the private confessional. You work it out with the priest. It's called the internal forum solution.
Okay.
So you're not actually doing anything objectively immoral at that point. But gosh, it's a real sacrifice to make.
Sure.
And then, and again, I'm not advocating this, but there is something called you're not bound, in this relationship, canonically or morally, right? Because you're not validly married. And so you got options there too, right?
Okay.
I'm not recommending that outcome. I'm just letting you know there are things you can do. But I would start with making the appeal, this is really important to me, and talk to the canonist of the diocese and see what your options are.
Stacy, thanks so much for your email. We have just enough time for Janice in Duluth, listening on the great Real Presence Radio. Janice, we just have a couple of minutes here. What's on your mind today?
Oh, are you talking to me?
Yes, I am, Janice. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Quick question. I'm trying to do the rosary in a year as a reintroduction to doing the rosary daily during Lent. And there was a visiting priest on that sort of criticized anyone who said the rosary at night and fell asleep. And he tried to make the premise that if you fell asleep intentionally, you went to do the rosary intentionally to fall asleep, that you best find another time to do it. But now I'm just convicted about this because I do the rosary in a year, and then I do a scriptural rosary after it, and I'll oftentimes, maybe once a week, fall asleep doing it. I've given up doing the rosary because I feel so convicted.
Okay, so for what it's worth, my spiritual director for many years, who's dead now and was a dear, dear, dear Dominican priest who I loved with all my heart and was one of the wisest men I ever knew, counseled me in my own experience of insomnia to use the rosary as a soporific tool to fall asleep.
Really?
Right, yeah. And I just personally strongly disagree with that counsel. And I think it runs against the entire spirit of Christ's teaching as well as the ends and goals of Catholic spirituality, right? So St. Augustine tells us that at the end of the day, the entire Catholic faith is there to serve one end, and that's the development of the love of God and neighbor and the life of the virtues. And you do what's useful for that, right? And so, I mean, if the rosary is a useful prayer for you, St. Thomas says that prayer without intention, with wandering thoughts, is still meritorious. That's what he teaches. This is in St. Thomas. He's the common doctor of the church, right?
Yeah.
So my view is, if the rosary is your prayer, more rosary always better, less rosary always worse. Half a rosary better than no rosary. I mean, it's not magic. It's not like a sacrament where you have to, sacraments aren't magic either, but it's not the sort of thing where you have a formula you have to repeat for it to be efficacious. It's efficacious as you love it. Use it how you want to. Pray half of it. Do 1 decade. Do three Hail Mary. I don't care. Just do it. That's fine.
Janice, thanks so much for your call. Dr. David Anders, have a great weekend.
Thank you, Tom.
Hope that you have a great weekend as well. We will see you Monday on Call to Communion. God bless.
Well, as we continue our Lenten season, more great conversations happening at Podcast Central.
If I then understand how I fit in, how I contribute, I'm not thinking about whether something's important to me, it's important to us.
It really was being at a Baptist school that had serious Catholics on the faculty that kind of pushed me to reconsider what I had abandoned as a youngster.
I'm X McKay, inviting you to join me for Catholics Coast to Coast tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Protecting the sanctity of life.
This is EWTN Radio.
Open Line Friday with Colin Donovan is next on most of these EWTN stations.
This is Dr. David Anders. If you missed part of today's show, catch the encore tonight at 11 Eastern or anytime at EWTN Podcast Central. Visit us at EWTN.com/radio/podcasts.
I recently met someone who said she had a sin that she just didn't know how to confess. Just sit down in confession and say it, I told her. And if that's hard, write it down and hand it to the priest. He'll take it from there. As I gave that simple advice, it struck me that one of the things we're most criticized for is that our prayer can become too ritualistic as Catholics. Yet ritual is one of the greatest things about Catholicism. We can just show up and go through the motions, and God does the rest. And even if your heart is weak and your mind is distracted, God knows how to do His part. Need spiritual food? Get to Mass and God will feed you. Mourning a death? Go to a funeral and God will walk you through your grief. Carrying guilt around? Go to confession, speak your sin, and leave a new person. That takes some of the pressure off, doesn't it? This is Chris Stefanik from RealLifeCatholic.com on EWTN Radio.
Prayer is powerful because it's prayer.